I have the collected letters of Raymond Aron here, Carlos, and I'm going to do some readings.
Yeah. My apologies.
No, I kid because I love.
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Carlos Lozada.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm Lydia Polgreen.
And this is Matter of Opinion. Oh, where thoughts are allowed. And clear. Allowed and clear. Do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do. All right, so the Democratic Convention has come to a close. Now we know exactly who Kamala Harris is and what she stands for, which is freedom. And we know who the Democrats are, who they're pitching themselves to be in this campaign. I imagine it's all crystal clear to all of you now. Is that right? I see Ross grimacing.
No, it's completely clear. The Democratic Party did not nominate Donald Trump.
For the third straight time.
For the third straight time.
So, all right, let's start off with the case that Kamala Harris just made. We are speaking immediately after the end of her speech on Thursday evening, late Thursday evening. So, what did you guys make of the speech?
I mean, I think that this is perhaps the clearest and most sort of fulsome articulation of what we have been hearing from Kamala Harris, since she became the presumptive and then actual nominee for the Democratic Party just a few weeks ago. And I think the case is basically, I am a pretty normal Democrat who is falling back on some pretty standard American ideas about the country that we are and the policies that Americans want. And, I found it to be, I think, a pretty deft threading of a number of tricky needles. And, it was definitely not the sort of soaring rhetoric or red meat of the Michelle Obama speech or other things that we've heard over the last few days. But I felt like it got the job done in terms of what the message that she's trying to send about her candidacy and what she has planned for the country.
What is that message?
I'm not Donald Trump. I represent core American values, just like you, the ones that matter to you. And I'm a safe pair of hands that can continue the country along a path to normalcy and out of, what has been a, extraordinarily aberrant period in American life.
Abortions for some, little American flags for others, I think, is the essential message. The speech went into detail, as far as I could tell, on Roe v. Wade being a good thing and Donald Trump being responsible for overturning it. It went into some detail, I guess, on foreign policy in a kind of generic America should lead the free world and Donald Trump has creepy affection for tyrants and strongmen. And it went into some detail on January 6th being a disgraceful event and not wishing to bring back the man responsible for that disgrace. So, pro-choice patriotism, I guess, was sort of the substantive argument. There was a little bit of economic policy. I thought it was quite striking that there was no attempt to deliver some sort of State of the Union style ringing, Joe Biden and I made this the greatest economy in history kind of thing, right? Which I think is probably somewhat disappointing to liberals who have thought that, Biden himself didn't do enough to talk up the Biden economy. It's sort of an interesting choice. I think there's sort of a decision here to kind of try and separate completely, or not completely. There were the moments of saying, Joe Biden and I are working hard to solve these foreign policy issues, and Joe Biden and I would have solved the border crisis, except Donald Trump, sabotaged a border security bill. That stuff was in there. But generally, there was sort of a, clean break with the last 4 years, hit a few themes and move on. And it was, like 1/3 as long as Trump's speech. And I give it a lot of credit for that, not least because it makes the job of podcasters a lot easier. We can be slightly more lucid, not having to sit through a 90-minute stem winder. But yeah, it continues. I agree with Lydia. It continues the presentation of the Harris campaign that we've seen to date, which I think one could reasonably say is a little bit thin. but I think they think it's been working for them.
And also, it hasn't been that long since she's been the presumptive and actual nominee. But Carlos, what did you think?
So I thought it made sense that she would distance herself from the Biden record, particularly in the economy, right? When so much of her story is about, we're going to lower the cost of living, it's a reminder of when the cost of living shot up, right? And it was under their watch. And so that seemed a pretty reasonable way to go about that part of the story. She's in a tough spot of trying to run both as a change agent while in fact being an incumbent. And you see throughout the week, there was a lot of sort of credit mongering on her behalf for all the stuff that people liked in the Biden record and sort of a lot of silence on the stuff that people did not like on the Biden record. Bernie Sanders did a lot of that. But for me, what really sort of loomed largest, and is probably not surprising given how she's been campaigning so far, is that sort of the leaning in fully into the prosecutor story. As a prosecutor, she represents the people, Kamala Harris for the people. She spoke of her journey from the courthouse to the White House. She says everyone has a right to safety, dignity, and justice is what she learned as a prosecutor. And in our system of justice, harm against anyone is a harm against all of us. To me, one of the more striking contrasts that she did, rhetorically speaking at least, was, my entire career I've had only one client, the people. Donald Trump has had only one client, and that is himself. And of course, what's fascinating about Harris leaning into the prosecutor persona is how miserably that failed in 2020. Or in 2019, she didn't even make it to 2020 when she was running for president back then, right? The party was in a different place. The country was in a different place. Now the prosecutor message has more resonance. In her first book, she was smart on crime. Then in her second book, she was a progressive prosecutor. Now the campaign calls her a pragmatic prosecutor, sort of shifting back. And it seems like a moment that the country is sort of more ready for that kind of message. So I don't know if it's just, her shifting with the political winds finally like made that match, or if it's really the moment when the kind of prosecutor that she really sees herself as finally meets a kind of moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think that you can tell that this speech had to accomplish many different things, right? I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges that Kamala Harris has is that most people just don't really know who she is, right? Or don't really know what she believes or what she stands for. Even though she's been in public life for a long time, she ran for president. It didn't go particularly well. She dropped out, before a single vote was cast. She gets picked as vice president. We've sort of rehearsed the history of her political career. And so I think that there has been this need to sort of introduce yourself. And one of the things that really struck me listening to the speech is that, she did something that she hasn't done that often on the stump, which is like really kind of narrate the story of her family and her life. And it was striking to me how much less comfortable and natural she seemed telling that story than she did once she sort of got into the full, this is the story of my career and my, the choices that I made as a prosecutor and the things that I did, that there was just a very clear cadence and way of telling that story. And that style of storytelling didn't sort of go throughout the whole speech. I felt a real kind of like abrupt pivot, which is just really interesting to me. And I think that one of the struggles that she has had in the past, and I think will have going forward, is making that kind of emotional connection that sort of is a connective tissue between her life story and her work in a way that feels like it's all a kind of integrated whole. And it just really struck me that she seemed just a lot less comfortable in the first part of the speech and a lot less natural than in the latter part.
I tend to agree with you and sort of looking at the cadence of the speech. And yet when you say that she might struggle to make that emotional connection, I've been told that this whole thing is about joy. Right? It's all about emotions. It's all about the feeling you get when you see Kamala Harris campaigning. One of our colleagues in Opinion wrote about the power of her smile. Right?
No,
this is
totally.
So there's emotions and there's emotions.
There's emotions, but that feels quite sort of abstracted from like the actual story that she's telling, right? I mean, someone can have charisma and you really don't know anything about who they are, right? Like you can be an attractive person, you can be a talented public speaker, and that's just a different thing from, I think that sort of magical combination of story, biography, policy, all of that kind of those things that come together into one thing.
Well, I mean, on that point, we've had a full convention here, right? Which means we've gotten the presidents of the Democratic parties passed. And I think in different ways, both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were much closer to that kind of synthesis, right? That you're describing. Obama was more sort of cerebral, but also sort of soaring in his rhetoric. Clinton was always sort of folksier and more granular. I don't think either of them gave the greatest speech of their life or career at all in this particular convention. But I think even in the speeches they did give, you could see something, that they had that I don't think Harris has achieved. I think this was a perfectly fine speech for the campaign that they're trying to run. And I'm not damning it with faint praise. I'm just, I think, sort of describing the zone that it was operating in and trying to operate in. I think at the very end, when you got into sort of the flourishes, I did have a little bit of a kind of Veep feeling that I maybe alone among commentators still get from Harris.
Veep as in the television show, you mean?
Veep as in the television show where you're sort of, the political candidate is sort of wading through cliche in certain ways. I thought there was some of that at the end of the speech. We haven't talked about the Israel-Gaza portion. I was trying to describe earlier moments where there was actually some substance. I left that out. That was the place where she was sort of very self-consciously trying to bridge what it feels like the biggest internal divide in the Democratic Party right now, doing a lot of on the one hand, on the other hand, we're going to get to a good outcome for everybody kind of thing. I don't know. What did you think of that part, Lydia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was certainly the most kind of emotionally satisfying, full-throated talk about Palestinian suffering. And I think there was definitely a need for that, to talk about, what's happening in Gaza and the toll that's happening there. I think an equally full-throated, I will support Israel. I will give Israel as president, what it needs to defend itself. So I think a very carefully balanced and measured twinning of those things. But yeah, it did feel like a very substantive and frankly necessary kind of emotional connection and recognition that what is happening in Gaza can't continue to happen in Gaza. Whether that's enough to bridge those divides, I don't know. It should be said that there was talk that there was going to be a kind of 1968 style blood in the streets, huge protests, and that just didn't happen. And at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of pressure to have a Palestinian American speak at the convention. There was a copy of a speech that was from a Georgia lawmaker, a state lawmaker whose family emigrated from Jordan, originally from Palestine. And that person was not allowed to make that speech. They ultimately weren't able to negotiate it. And that felt like a missed opportunity. It would have been, I think, good for the party to actually have that voice appear, given, that we were treated to lots and lots of Republicans on stage. There surely could have been 2 or 3 minutes for a Palestinian American lawmaker to speak. But all of that being said, I do think that the Israel-Gaza portion of the speech was important and notable. And much like the way that she talked about abortion, something that I think Joe Biden just simply couldn't pull off. There just was no way that he was going to be able to thread that needle in the same way that she did.
I think there's threading the needle, and then there's just sort of giving something to both sides to sort of have some emotional resonance and satisfaction. It's like we will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and we will, give Israel the resources it needs. And at the same time, the heartbreaking suffering in Gaza. I guess she would, one of her favorite phrases in her writings is false choices. She doesn't like to be pinned down between, dichotomies that she doesn't like.
Hate false choices. Those are the worst choices.
And so I think she would say this is a false choice. I'm for Israel and I'm for the people of Gaza and Palestinian self-determination. So I think she sort of gave everyone involved, sentences to latch onto. But that's obviously one of the big tensions within the Democratic Party. So what I hope we can get into after the break is a sense of where, based on this convention, we see that the party is headed. And we'll be right back. So one thing that has come up a lot in the discussion around this convention is the notion of passing the torch. Torch passing. It sounds a little bit dangerous to me, but it is something that the party is doing. And I'm curious as to how you see this torch being passed. Is it Biden to Harris? Is it the Obamas to Harris skipping Biden? Who's passing the torch, and where is the final or the next relay of this relay race going?
I don't know if a torch is being passed exactly. There's all kinds of talk about tensions between the Biden camp and the Obama camp and Nancy Pelosi and so on. But I think if you were just watching this convention as a, sort of somewhat politically aware, but not too politically aware viewer, the main thing you would take away is sort of the normalcy of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, unlike the Republican Party, likes its former presidents, right? You had former presidents there. You did not have George W. Bush at the Republican convention. It likes its leaders, old and new, generally. It's comfortable with itself. It doesn't have a situation where you have to sort of stack the successful governors earlier in the week and then have the nominee's family talking about him on the final day, as you did with the Republican convention and Trump. So in that sense, I think that the structure of the convention fit well in a way with the approach that Harris herself took in her speech, which is basically to sort of say, look, you wanted a generic Democrat, right, to run against Trump. I'm a generic Democrat. This was a generic Democratic convention. We didn't have any big fights. As Lydia said earlier, there wasn't, blood in the streets. This wasn't 1968. The tensions were sort of interesting, but somewhat subterranean in a lot of cases. And here we are, America. We have normal positions, normal politicians. Vote for us. We're not weird. I think that was the message sent. Not so much a sense of like, we have this mission and here's Kamala Harris, she's carrying on this mission. There was no like Ted Kennedy in his 1980 convention speech sort of.
The hope will never die.
Right.
The dream will never die,
dream,
sorry.
It's late. I'm not going to quote Ted Kennedy, but it was normalcy. And my question, I think the question that hangs over all of this is, isn't this what the Democrats have sort of offered before against Trump, right? And is it actually enough? And I think if Harris loses in November, as is still quite possible, people may look back and say, man, the Democrats didn't really say a lot at this 4-day extravaganza, except that they were normal and Trump is not.
Yeah, I think that what I saw was a very, very deep bench of charismatic and talented leaders, who are from the past and also, in the future, right? Like people who will be with us for a very long time. There were some fantastic speeches. What I didn't hear were a lot of new ideas or new direction for the country, right? And that to me is striking and worrying, right? Because what we're living through right now is a time where people are saying that they are not happy with the direction that the country is taking. And what I heard were a lot of sort of, here's how we're going to tinker on the margins to work on this thing and make that thing better, but not sort of like big transformational ideas. And, to be fair, the sort of cast of characters who've tried to offer big transformational ideas on the Democratic side are, people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. We saw a striking move from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, much closer to the center of the party. From, being more on the left. So I didn't think this was like an ideas or, hugely inspirational convention in terms of like thinking about this is a new direction for America. It felt much more of a restoration to a different kind of idea about America, which is ironic, right? Because, the Make America Great Again guy is Donald Trump, not not Kamala Harris. But in some ways, this is something of a nostalgic vision. And I think that there are a lot of big open questions about what a post-globalization, post-cosmopolitan, and perhaps even post-liberal world order looks like, and what sort of politics and policy this incredibly important political party is going to offer for that era is a question that they're effectively just kind of punting in favor of saying, like, Donald Trump is an aberrant figure, which he absolutely is, but we're also living through incredibly, turbulent times that do require new thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like a complacent convention, which is a weird thing to say, I think, about a party that has, to its great credit, sort of dispatched an unfit president and replaced him at the top of the ticket and acted in a very non-complacent way. And I think, as someone quite skeptical of the Democratic Party, I think Democrats deserve credit for being non-complacent in that way. But having done that, it felt like, okay, we did that. That was really hard. Let's not do anything else too crazy from here till November. And that could win them the election. If it does win them the election, it's going to be, I think, by an extremely narrow margin.
Yeah, I think it was going to be an extremely narrow margin no matter what. But yeah.
So you guys are clamoring for substance, and it seems like the main thing you got this week were constant references to freedom and then this constant attitude of joy. Is there anything behind freedom and joy? Not just as sort of a messaging mechanism, but substantively.
Sure. Freedom is not a code. It's just sort of a direct reference to a full-throated defense of social liberalism against social conservatism, with abortion as sort of the focal issue, but sort of, looping in other issues as well, that where, it seems like sort of social liberalism could be threatened by weird people who J.D. Vance has been on a podcast with, right? I think that's fairly straightforwardly what the freedom argument is about. The joy stuff, I think, is a mixture of democratic joy at having a normal candidate, like unfeigned, like we are really happy to have a generic Democrat instead of Joe Biden, combined with, again, I think a somewhat complacent version of the, America is really good. Why is Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, why are they so down on America kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the freedom pitch is broader than that. I think it's, strikingly, it's about free speech. I mean, I remember when Democrats were supposedly the scolds who wanted to, prevent people from talking and saying certain things, and the Republicans have, snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by enacting book bans and trying to ban drag shows and things like that, and turn themselves into the anti-free speech party miraculously. But I think there's also just, things like freedom to marry who you love, freedom to get a divorce or not marry at all, freedom to access gender-affirming care, freedom to go to school without worrying about being shot. I think they're trying to broaden these ideas of freedom beyond just, getting an abortion or not. And I think that joy is real, right? I mean, I think these have been joyless times. I think a lot of it is, I don't know, coming out of COVID, the specter and the sort of grim sort of struggle between these ancient men, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and then suddenly being able to, think about a different kind of future and a different kind of race. And I think that there are actual joyful people involved, right? I mean, Tim Walz seems like a really fun guy that people like. Kamala Harris seems like a lot of fun. She's actually someone you would want to have a drink with. Whereas J.D. Vance goes in and orders, doesn't seem to know how to order donuts at a donut shop. And, it just seems really, really strange and alienating. And Donald Trump is, of course, as people say, just sort of weird. So I think the joy is something that they come by honestly.
I mean, it's almost midnight, so I'm not going to go too deep here, but, first I'll just say that the Tim Walz shtick is just not for me. What he's selling is not, he's not trying to win my vote. So I'm not really a good judge of just how appealing he is. Maybe he really is just the joyful America's dad, the coach of all coaches, and I'm just too cynical to see it. But I'm not sure that he will actually wear well over the course of whatever span of time he remains at the center of American political life. We'll find out. I think there is something kind of amusing in that the sense of relief and that Democrats feel at the moment is in part the relief of escaping from strictures that they themselves were imposing. And that can mean sort of very literal things, like the fact that Tim Walz, like many Democratic governors, imposed a lot of strictures on people's lives during the pandemic that lasted way too long and did a lot of damage. And now it's like, well, they're lifted. We're filled with joy. And we'll just we won't talk about the fact that we ourselves were responsible for that. Or the joy of sort of, racing away from a bunch of politically implausible positions that all liberal politicians had to adopt in 2020, Kamala Harris included. And now we agree that we can just pretend those positions were never adopted in the first place and shake the Etch-a-Sketch and make them all go away. So yes, I think there is a sense of sort of a desire for freedom from the dark hand of conservative power. But there's also a sense of like, well, what if we just escaped from all the crazy things we ourselves did just a few short years ago? Wouldn't that be fun? And that's part of what the Democrats are doing too.
Well, let's talk about that during the 2028 Republican convention when they're no longer under the thumb of Donald Trump and can feel the joy of escaping.
The Dowsett Lozada ticket of 2028 is going to be joy-filled.
I'll give my quick thoughts on freedom and joy for whatever they're worth. The freedom thing, I mean, not to get too like Isaiah Berlin, but right, it's like the two concepts of liberty, right? The, freedom from, freedom
it's
to.
It's Isaiah Berlin, and it's 10 minutes to midnight, Carlos.
It's never too late.
It's never too late in the day,
Tim Walz is doing
too early for Isaiah Berlin.
Tim Walz is doing the freedom from business, right? With the whole mind their own damn business message to the Republicans, right? But of course, the Democrats are, sort of the party of regulation as well in some ways, and so restricting freedom too is also part of their agenda. The Republicans, especially the sort of parts of the party that maybe, as Ross would say, that J.D. Vance goes on podcasts with, they have a more restrictive vision of freedom these days. In the foreword to Project 2025, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, says that the Constitution grants us the liberty not to do what we want, but what we ought, and what we ought is to live as our Creator ordained. So I don't think that anyone has sort of a monopoly on the freedom train, to mix my metaphors there. As for joy, I think the message was, yes, Democrats joyful, Republicans weird. Joy lasts until the first failed piece of major legislation, until the first debt ceiling fight. Everyone who's high on the Kamala Harris, joyometer needs to remember how America was going to be post-racial with Barack Obama. It was not. Was it Mario Cuomo who said that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose? Maybe it was. But joy is the poetry of this campaign, right? It's the new hope and change. But it's hard to govern that way, right? Pete Buttigieg, who I like very much, said that, politics should be uplifting. It should be soulcraft, as he put it in his speech. Like I said, I'm a fan of Pete, but I really would love it if politics could be beautiful and uplifting and nourishing to the soul. It can also be like brutal and painful and soul-crushing compromise, right? And that's just the way it is, and that's okay. So let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll talk about where all that joy and freedom might take the Democrats over the next 70 days or so of this campaign when it rams up against Donald Trump. So we have now been through the Republican and Democratic conventions. So what would you say are the biggest opportunities and the biggest risks for both of the campaigns going forward over the next 10 weeks or so.
It's been sort of unfashionable, I think, at least on social media to say this, but, Kamala Harris really needs to do an interview, and she needs to take substantive questions, not just from the reporters who happen to be on her plane, but, in a press conference setting and things like that. And I think that she has had encounters with these kind of big media encounters that have not gone particularly well for her in the past. And so I think that's a big crucial test. And I think a place where things could go off the rails if she retreats to the kind of defensive stance that she's had in the past. And, Ross mentioned Tim Walz's quote unquote shtick running thin. I don't necessarily think that it's a shtick, but I think the risk that the person that he is and the personality that he puts across could wear, poorly, in the same way that the Republican vice presidential nominee's personality seems to be wearing very poorly. So, I think that's a risk, and both of those I think offer pretty significant opportunities for the Trump-Vance campaign.
I mean, I think there'll be a series of further manufactured political events that will attract a lot of attention and will be sort of the moments that there'll be
September 10th debate.
At least one presidential debate. I think the vice presidential debate will be quite fascinating to watch, regardless of what you think about the people involved. I think it'll be very interesting. And I don't know exactly how successfully Donald Trump can debate Kamala Harris. I think that successfully debating her would require even more restraint in certain ways than he showed in his debate against Joe Biden, when he sort of managed to get out of his own way and just enough to let Biden basically self-destruct. Harris is not going to self-destruct, and you could very easily imagine a debate bringing out the worst in Trump. With all that said, I kind of think that what we've seen, and may see further if Robert F. Kennedy drops out of the race, is a kind of reconsolidation of the polarized electorate that, sort of rules out some of the bigger swings that we've seen in polls so far in this weird year. And I think if you're Harris, as much as this convention was tried to act as if, there was no Biden presidency. She was not in charge of the Biden presidency. Joe Biden, if he exists, he spoke at 11:45 p.m., right? As much as that was sort of a dominant theme, it remains the case that, just how the economy goes, how the world goes in the next few months, are jobs numbers good? Does the stock market keep going up? Is there a ceasefire in the Middle East? Does something crazy happen in the world? All of that probably matters more than what happens in the debates or the tactical choices people make when it comes to sort of swinging the 2 to 3% of America that's going to decide this election.
We had multiple October surprises in July. And so I think you're right, Ross, that it's probably something extraneous to the regular rhythm of a campaign, conventions, debates, et cetera, that might nudge things in one direction or another. But I do think you've both hit on a challenge for both the Harris and the Trump campaign, which is that they probably should do the one thing that they don't want to do. For Harris, it's getting into specifics. I imagine she wants to ride the joy and freedom train as long as she possibly can. For Trump, it's not self-destructing on the campaign trail. He's talking about how he hates his opponents, how he's going to be mean. His aides seem to be unsuccessfully trying to talk him out of that. And so I think both of them are going to have to run counter to instinct here. And whoever's able to do that most successfully, I won't say is going to win, but it's probably going to have an advantage in what is a very, as Barack Obama put it, still a very tightly divided country. All right. On that note, in the wee hours now of the fifth day of the Democratic Convention, which is just ours, we will have to leave it there. And Ross,
get
Lydia,
some sleep,
go
guys.
to bed.
I will joyfully do so. Good night.
Okay.
See ya. You have the freedom to go to sleep, Ross. Matter of Opinion is produced by Phoebe Lett, Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, and Andrea Betanzos. It's edited by Jordana Hochman. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, Amin Sahota, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker and Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.